Hello everybody and welcome to chapter 21 of the book of Shemot as we continue to travel through Tanach. Chapter 21 has 37 verses and it starts in the Koren Sachs Chumash on page 508 and 509. This chapter marks the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, which opens with the words Ve'ele HaMishpatim, these are the laws. After the drama of Har Sinai, the Torah moves from revelation to regulation. And we move from a powerful narrative into a long list of real-life laws, focusing on civil law and human responsibility. The shift is striking. We've gone from thunder and revelation to oxen, pits, and personal injury. But the message is clear. Torah lives not just in the heavens, but in how we treat people in the messiness of daily life. Before we get into the details of the chapter, it helps to step back and see the bigger picture, because Parshas Mishpatim can feel like a long list of unrelated laws, and in fact we will see that there are 24 mitzvot brought just in this parsha alone, and in chapter 21 there's actually 13 of these mitzvot. There are 9 positive mitzvot and 4 negative mitzvot. And so while it seems a bit disjointed, it's actually very carefully structured. The chapter breaks down into 4 main sections. First, verses 1 to 11 deal with the Eved Ivri and the Ama Ivriyah, Hebrew servant and Hebrew maidservant. This is really about power and responsibility. What happens when one person has control over another? And how does the Torah limit that power and protect human dignity? In verses 12 to 17, we move to the most serious crimes: murder, kidnapping, and violence or disrespect towards parents. These are the Torah's non-negotiables, the foundations of a moral society, life, freedom, and family. From there, verses 18 to 27 shift into cases of personal injury, fights, damages, and compensation. This is where we encounter the famous phrase, an eye for an eye, which our rabbis understand as financial compensation. The Torah here is building a system of accountability, not revenge. And finally, verses 28 to the end deal with damages caused by property, especially the famous cases of the ox. Here the focus is on negligence and indirect harm, not just what you do, but what you allow to happen under your watch. So the flow of the chapter is not random at all. It moves from how we treat people under our authority to the most severe acts of harm, to everyday injury and compensation, and then to responsibility for damage we didn't directly cause. Or to put it simply, the Torah is expanding our sense of responsibility from what we do to what we cause to what we're accountable for, even indirectly. And so as we encounter the laws of the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave, we need to understand a couple of things here too, because it can make us feel a little uncomfortable. The moment we hear the word slave, we instinctively think of the worst forms of slavery in history: coercion, abuse, and dehumanization. But the Torah system here is something very different. In most cases, an Eved Ivri is not someone captured or forced into lifelong servitude. He's either someone who has stolen and can't repay, or someone who has fallen into poverty and voluntarily sells his labor as a way of rebuilding his life. And the Torah places very clear limits on this arrangement. It's temporary, 6 years, and that's it. He goes free. It's regulated. The master has obligations towards him and his family, and most importantly, it's framed around dignity. A master has to treat his slave with so much respect. He has such a level of responsibility in his ownership. So rather than seeing this as the Torah endorsing slavery, it's more accurate to see it as the Torah transforming an existing economic reality into something far more humane, a structured system that protects the vulnerable and prevents exploitation. And that's what we see with the Hebrew maidservant as well. Sometimes a parent would just be unable to financially provide for their daughters. And so by putting them into this maidservant arrangement, they would know that their daughter was being taken care of. That fits perfectly with the theme that we've just outlined, because the very first case the Torah chooses right after Sinai, right after we have come out of slavery and servitude, we encounter this question: what do you do when you have power over someone else? It is worth pointing out that each and every single one of these cases in this chapter becomes its own sugya, becomes its own topic in the Talmudic discourse, meaning to think that we will understand the full extent of these laws just by reading the verses is probably unrealistic. There are pages and pages and pages devoted to understanding each and every single one of these mitzvot, and cases explored from every single angle. And so if you have questions, that's entirely reasonable, because chances are the Talmud and the books of Jewish law will discuss them at great length. So with all of that in mind, let's turn now to chapter 21, verse 1. Ve'ele hamishpatim, these are the laws, and these are the laws asher tasim lifneihem, that you shall set before them. And our rabbis point out that vav at the beginning of the word ve'ele hamishpatim, that vav means and, because it is connecting this parsha, this portion, to the previous parsha, indicating to us that just like we received the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, we received all of these mundane laws as well. It is all part of one whole system. And so we're going to read now about the Hebrew slave and the Hebrew maidservant. We're going to see there are 5 mitzvot here. The mitzvah of the law of the Hebrew slave, the mitzvah that relates to yi'ud, where one marries a female maidservant, the mitzvah as it relates to freeing and redeeming a female maidservant, the prohibition of selling on a Hebrew maidservant that one acquires from her father, and the rules that are in place to protect a Hebrew maidservant who one marries, to make sure that she is not deprived of food or of clothing or her most intimate emotional and physical needs. Verse 2, Ki sikne eved ivri, sheish shanim ya'avod. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. Uvashviis, and in the 7th year, yetze lechavshi chinam. He shall go forth free. Verse 3, in bekapo yavo, begapo yetze. If he comes in alone, he shall leave alone. In bali shahu, but if he was a married man when he came into this arrangement, v'yatsa ishto imo, then his wife shall leave with him at the end. Verse 4, im adonav yiten lo isha, if his master gave him a wife during his period of servitude, v'yalda lo vanim o vanos, and she bore him sons or daughters, ha'isha viladeha, the woman and her children, tihiyeh ladoneha, shall remain her master's, v'hu yetze bekapo, while he shall leave alone. Verse 5, V'im amor yomar ha'eved, but if the slave says to him, Ahavti es adoni, I love my master, es ishti and my wife, v'es banai and my children, lo yetze chavshi, I do not wish to go free. Verse 6, V'gisho adonav el ha'elohim, then his master shall bring him before the judges in the court, v'higisho el adeles, and he shall take him to the door, or el hamuzuzah, or to the doorpost, v'ratza adonav esazno b'martseah, and he should pierce his ear with an awl, v'avado le'olam, and after that he shall then remain his slave forever. Now a couple of things to unpack over here. Our rabbis explain that forever isn't actually forever, and if beyond these 7 years he wants to remain a slave, he actually only remains a slave for the duration of the rest of a 50-year period, and then he would go free anyway. This ritual involving piercing his ear, our rabbis explain that the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, lo signov, to not steal, he has gone and stolen, and that is what has led him to become an Eved. Alternatively, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai that one should not have any other gods before him has decided that actually he would like another master on top of him instead of just Hashem. And the doorpost that had been there for the Israelites on the eve of their redemption in Egypt, where they are being freed from their servitude and their slavery, now that this person is opting in to still remain as a slave, that is why this ritual takes place at the doorpost. Verse 7, V'chiyim kor ish es bito la'ama, if a man sells his daughter as a maidservant, which as we said may be because he cannot financially afford to look after her, lo seitze ketseso avadim, she does not go free in the usual way of slaves. Verse 8, Imra'ah be'enei adoneha, if she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, asher lo ya'ada, and who would have otherwise married her, vehefta, he must let her be redeemed. but with a caveat, La'am nochri lo yimshol lamachra b'vigdova. But he has no right to sell her to foreigners, to non-Jews, because he has broken faith with her. Verse 9, V'im livno yiyadena, and if he intends for her to marry his son, Kamishpat abanos yasela, and he shall grant her all the rights of a young woman. Verse 10, Im acheres yikach lo, and if he marries another woman alongside her, She'era, Kasusa, Va'onosa, lo yigra, then he shall not deprive her of her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. Verse 11, V'im shlosh eile lo yasela, if he fails her in any of these three things, v'yatza chinam ein kasef, then she shall go forth for free without paying anything. Our chapter continues now from verse 12, with various scenarios where a person would be liable to capital punishment. In Jewish law, there are actually 4 types of capital punishment. Without getting lost in the details of how these punishments would be administered, they are as follows: skila, which is stoning; sreifa, which is burning; hereg, which is execution by the sword; and chelek, which is strangulation. On another occasion, we'll actually explain a bit more about these types of capital punishment. But the key point to know before we go into it is this: the Torah takes these crimes absolutely seriously, while at the same time, the bar of proof is so high that in practice and in history, these punishments were administered extremely rarely. Instead, these punishments were to act as deterrents, so that people would not get into these situations. So let's go through these together. Verse 12, Makeh ish vames mos yumas. One person who strikes another so that he dies shall be put to death. Verse 13, V'asher lo tzadah. But if he was not lying in wait to harm him, v'ha'elohim ina liado, but the incident came about by an act of God, v'samti lecha makom asher yanus shama, then Hashem says, I shall provide you a place to which he can flee. So someone who murders inadvertently can run to a city of refuge, where he will be protected. Verse 14, V'chi yazid ish al reyehu lahago ba'arma. If a man shall act intentionally against his fellow to murder him with stealth, me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamus, then you shall take him even from my altar to die. Verse 15, Umakei aviv ve'imo, one who wounds his father or mother, mos yumas, shall be put to death. Verse 16, V'gonev ish umcharo, one who kidnaps a person and sells him, v'nimsa v'yado, or if he was found in his possession, mos yumas, he shall be put to death. And actually the punishment for him would be chenek, strangulation. Verse 17, Umekalel aviv ve'imo, one who curses his father or mother, mos yumas, shall be put to death, with the punishment of skila, of being stoned. And as we reach verse 18, we move into a completely different area of damages and compensation. Our rabbis outline 5 categories of payment when one person injures another. Nezek, which is paying for the actual damage, the loss of your market value. Tsa'ar, pain, which is calculated by how much someone would pay to avoid the pain that they have just suffered. Ripui, which are the medical costs. Sheves, which are the loss of earnings. And Boshes, the embarrassment that has been caused. What's striking here is how comprehensive this is. The Torah isn't just asking, what did you break? It's asking, what did this person experience? Physical, financial, emotional, everything is taken into account. Verse 18, V'chi ravun anashim. If 2 people are fighting, V'hika ish esreyehu be'even or ve'egrof, and one strikes another with a stone or his fist, V'lo yamus, and he does not die, V'nofala mishkav, but is confined to his bed. Verse 19, Im yakum, if afterwards he gets up, V'ishalech bachutz, and walks outdoors, al mishanto, under his own power, V'nikah hamakeh, then the assailant is absolved. Rak shivto yitain, he must only pay for his loss of work, V'rapo yirapeh, and he shall pay his medical bills as well. And what's really interesting here is on these words, V'rapo yirapeh, we see a clear indication that Judaism approves of seeking medical support, whereas in other religions and other cultures, the perspective might be that you may not seek medical intervention. Verse 20, V'chiyakeh ish es avdo, if a man strikes his slave, or his female maidservant, bashevet, with a rod, umeis tachas yado, and the slave dies there, nakom yinakein, then the death shall be avenged. Verse 21, achim yom or yomayim yamod, but if he survives for a day or two, lo yukam, ki kasbohu, then the death shall not be avenged, since the money lost belongs to the master. Verse 22, v'chi natsu anashim, if two men fight, v'nagfu isha hara, and they collide with a pregnant woman, v'yatsu yiladeha, and she miscarries, v'lo yihiyeh ason, but there is no fatality, anosh yianesh, ka'asher yashis alav, bal ha'isha, the offender must be fined, as the woman's husband demands, v'nasan biflilim, and he shall pay by order of the judges. Verse 23, v'im ason yihiyeh, but if there shall be a fatality, v'nosata nefesh tachas nefesh, then you must compensate a life for a life. Verse 24, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, shein tachas shein, a tooth for a tooth, yad tachas yad, a hand for a hand, regel tachas ragel, a foot for a foot. Verse 25, kavia tachas kavia, a burn for a burn, petza tachas patza, a wound for a wound, chabura tachas chabura, and a bruise for a bruise. And as we said earlier, in all of these cases it means financial compensation. At no point has there ever been an expectation in Jewish law that if someone's hand gets cut off, that perpetrator has to have their hand cut off in return. Verse 26, V'chiyakeh ish es ein avdo, and if a man should strike the eye of his slave, or es ein amaso, or the eye of his maidservant, v'shichasa, and destroy it, lechavshi yishalchenu tachas eino, he must send the slave out free on account of his eye. Verse 27, Vim shein avdo, or shein amaso yapil, if the tooth of his servant or the tooth of his maidservant falls out, lechavshi yishalchenu tachas shino, he must send the slave out free on account of his tooth. And now as we come to verse 28, we move into the cases of the ox. So it's not the person who's causing the injury or the fatality, but the property of a person who's causing the injury or fatality. And here we're introduced to another key distinction, the difference between a shor tam and a shor muad. A shor tam is an animal that has no history of causing damage. If it harms someone, the owner has to pay half damages. But a shor muad is an animal that has already shown a pattern of dangerous behavior, and at that point the owner is fully responsible and pays the full amount of damages. In other words, the Torah recognizes a difference between something unexpected and something you should have anticipated. Verse 28, V'chi yigach shor es ish or es isha v'mes. If an ox gores a man or a woman and they die, sakol yisakel hashor, the ox shall be stoned to death, v'lo ye'achel es besaro, its flesh may not be eaten, uval hashor naki, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable to any punishment himself, beyond the loss of his ox. Verse 29, Vim shor nagachu mitzmol shilshon, but if the ox has already gored in the past, v'huad bivalav, and its owner had been warned, v'lo yishmerenu, but had failed to guard it, v'hemis ish or isha, and it kills a man or a woman, hashor yisakel, then the ox shall be stoned to death, v'gam ba'alav yumas, and its owner shall also be put to death. Verse 30, Im kofer yushas alav, if a ransom is imposed on his life, v'nosan pidyon nafsho, kachol asher yushas alav, then he shall pay whatever is imposed on him and redeem his life. Verse 31, or vein yigach, or vas yigach, whether it gores a boy or it gores a girl, kamishpat hazeh yeyaseh. This rule also applies. Verse 32, Im eved yigach hashor or amah, if the ox gores a slave or a maidservant, kesef shloshim shekalim yitein ladonav v'hashor yisakel, then the owner shall give 30 shekels of silver to the master, and the ox must be stoned to death. And although 30 shekalim would be worth roughly 250, 300 pounds today, back then it would have corresponded closer to several weeks or even a few months' worth of wages. So it's a pretty hefty sum. And it's important to understand that a human being can never really be reduced to a number. But the Torah is assigning concrete responsibility. When harm is done, it can't remain abstract. It has to be felt in the real world. Verse 33, V'chi yiftach ish bor, if a man uncovers a hole, a pit, or ki yichre ish bor, v'lo yichasenu, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, v'nafal shamashor or chamor, and an ox or a donkey falls into it. Verse 34, Bal habor yishalem, then the owner of the pit shall make restitution. Kesef yashiv livalav, he shall give its owner its full value. V'hameis yihiyeh lo, and then the carcass belongs to him. Verse 35, V'chi yigof shor ish es shor reyehu, if one man's ox shall strike another ox, v'ameis, and it dies, umachru es hashor achai, they shall sell the live ox, v'chatzu es kaspo, and share the money, v'gam es hameis yechetzun, and the dead animal they shall also share and divide the value of. Verse 36, on noda, but if it becomes known, kishor nagachu mitmol shilshom, that the ox had gored in the past, v'lo yishmerenu ba'alav, and still the owner failed to guard it, shalem yishalem, then he shall surely pay shor tachas hashor, an ox for an ox, v'hameis yihiyeh lo, and the dead animal shall belong to him. And finally, verse 37, ki yignov ish shor oseh, if a person steals an ox or a sheep, utvacho, and kills it, or mecharo, or sells it, then we have a very unique rule of compensation. Chamisha vakar yishalem tachas hashor, he shall pay 5 oxen for an ox, v'arbat son tachas haseh, and 4 sheep for a sheep. So the thief doesn't just repay what he stole, but may have to pay 4 or 5 times the value. And again, the message is clear. This isn't just about replacing the object, it's about deterrence, accountability, and restoring moral balance. So that brings us to the end of chapter 21. I know that was long, but I look forward nevertheless to learning chapter 22 with you very soon. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful day.